So in the previous videos, I showed you a couple of things you could do with shapes, but we didn't really go over them that much, and there were a lot of things that you can do with shapes that I didn't mention. So let's take a closer look at shapes. And it's decided not to give me a new canvas. That's okay, I'll create my own. Size doesn't really matter because I'm just playing with shapes. Now, in the left menu, I've already shown you where the shapes are, and if we click and hold down, you can see your different options. Now, one of the nice things about Illustrator is not only do you have all these windows here, but you also have windows that aren't shown here that you can turn into windows. So like, let's say, that you like how some of these windows work, like the Pathfinder window having this handy and ready here. If you find yourself using lots of shapes and you don't want to have to constantly go and click and hold down, you can instead click this little button here, and that will pull out these shapes into a little window for you. So now I can quickly jump from one shape to another without having to click and hold down here all the time. And if I didn't mean to do that, I can always close it. I've also got that little button there to turn it sideways if I like that better. So I've already shown you some of these shapes, like the rectangle. Let's give these a color. Or the rounded rectangle, the circle, which can also be an ellipse if you don't hold shift, and polygon, and the star, and the flare, which in my opinion isn't really a shape to me, it's more of an effect, but that's okay. Now in each one of these you can also click instead of dragging, and that lets you change some of the parameters, like how many points do you want your star to have, or how big do you want the inner circle or the outer circle to be. Or for like a polygon, how many sides? Do you want it to be just 3 so that way you can have a triangle? Or do you want something a little bit more unusual, like 11, and that would be called, I don't know, whatever an 11-sided shape is called. Or your rounding rectangle, where you can set how round you want the corners to be. Right, so that's easy enough. And now once you create a shape, as we've already talked about, and as we've seen, these are defined by code. And so because they're defined by code and not by individual pixels, you can easily manipulate them, go back and modify them, because it's not distorting and damaging pixels each time, it's just changing the code. And that allows you to change colors very easy, or give it an outline very easy, and change what that looks like as many times as you want without damaging the actual pixels, because it's all done later when you export the thing. Now a couple other things that I wanted to show. Let's say that we make ourselves a rounded rectangle, and let's increase the corner radius. I like 50, I think it's pretty decent. So what if you want multiple copies of the same shape? Well, you could try to draw it out each time and try to get it to be exactly the same size, and of course you've got these little guidelines that help, but there's an easier way. You don't need to use just the guides. Instead, you could just do Command C and Command V, right? That's easy. A lot of people are familiar with that. Just copy and paste, so that way you know it's the same. But Illustrator actually has an even easier way. Instead of Command C and Command V, you could actually even just hold Option and click and drag, and that will make a copy for you. As many as I want, right? I don't think I need that many. And in addition to modifying it here with these rotational tools, I can also go in and modify it with my direct selection arrow, which allows me to modify the individual points and the curves and all of these things. And I can even define whether this is smooth or a corner or whatnot. So it really gives me a lot of options in how I want to manipulate my shapes. To get some really wonky things going on if that's what I desire. In addition to this sort of transformation, I also have these options up here, and a lot of these are fairly similar to what I can already do. Like, for example, I can rotate this a certain amount of degrees, and I can preview it. But really, how different is that from just doing this? It's not really that different. Now, part of the difference is when I'm rotating here, even my little tooltip, it tells me roughly where the angle is, but if I want to transform from this point a specific amount, sometimes that's easier than trying to get it just right using the rotate on the corners. But there are some options up here that I cannot do as easily with just my arrows, with my selection tool, or with my direct selection tool, such as the shear. And what this does is it actually like pulls to one side at the top and pulls to a different side at the bottom, and you can get some really funky stuff with that if that's what you want to do. And there's some other ones up here too that I recommend that you try out. Now, in addition to that, this is kind of a weird shape already, let's actually use just a regular square, and that will make it easier to see what's going on here. So you can see what the shear is doing, right? And if I switch to vertical, then you can see what the shear is doing there. Now, I've also got this whole set of transformation tools here that behave quite a bit differently. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull this out also, just so you can quickly see what these do. So personally, I find the width tool quite interesting. That's this first one here, sort of the first choice up here. And we can actually do that to increase the width of our path. And right now it's black, but if we change our path to a different color, like say red, then you can see what it's doing. And we could change this to a different texture, we could change this to a different default base, and we could then modify it if we wanted to instead. And you can start to see something that you can do with it that can create some very interesting things going on. And you can actually see how I'm starting to manipulate it up here in this width option there. Alright, let's go ahead and delete that and go back to just what we started with, just to make it easier to see what other tools do. We've also got like the warp tool, which we can use to warp in different directions. A twirl, which the longer you hold down, the more it twirls. So a click quick will do less than holding it down for a long time and getting something really crazy like that, which you can't even see what's going on. And there's the pucker tool, which kind of pulls stuff in. And this tool works a little differently in that when you click and hold down, you can pull from multiple places and kind of drag it around if that's what you want to do, and you can actually see how it's pulling the paths. And of course I can Command Z to get rid of that. And let's actually Command Z quite a bit of this and go back to our square, our rectangle. We have a bloat, which does the exact opposite. Instead, it pushes stuff out. Now let's actually make my square a little bit smaller, because this will be easier to see with a smaller square. So if we do pucker with the small square, you can see how it's pulling everything in. And if we do bloat with the small square, you can see how it's pushing everything out. We'll make this bigger for the next tool. We've got the scallop tool, which does some interesting things. and crystallize, which pulls sort of out, sort of similar but opposites, and a wrinkle tool. So playing with these can be fun. Now, just like you can modify the properties of the polygon tool, we can also modify the properties of these. Now, if we just click once, it actually makes the action happen. So to be able to modify these, instead we double click the tool, and that lets us adjust some of these, like the intensity and the level of detail and how big our brush is. And so that might give you some of the control that you're looking for. If you didn't realize that you had it, you do have a fair bit of control, and you can go in and modify these, so that way you have more control over it and you can hopefully get the shape that you want. Personally, I like knocking the intensity down on a lot of these quite a bit, so that way I can actually watch as it happens and then choose exactly when I want to let go instead of just clicking and hoping. Now, something else to try out: what happens when you have two shapes? So if we have a blue square and, let's say, a pink square, we can see that it can actually modify both. However, if we have one square in specific clicked on, it will only modify that one and not both. So it is important that you're aware of how that behavior differs.